Welcome to Mad Men, Men, where we gather in the creative lounge to discuss and analyze each episode of the AMC series Mad Men, which aired between 2007 and 2015. One of us is a first-time watcher of the show. One of us went through it just once back when it was airing. And then there's me who, you know me. I'm always reading books about flowers and blades. I'm John Agroni. And Will Ashton, I'm going to have to ask you to go home from the sleepover because I caught you watching The Great Escape. And
okay.
I would rather you not watch that movie in my... We don't do that in my house. I don't know what goes on in yours, but...
No, Steve McQueen fan?
I'm a big... I'm just doing... I'm putting on a little show for the listeners, trying to villainize myself.
That doesn't make any sense, though. It doesn't, there's no connection to Steve McQueen in the episode or anything, so...
It's the first movie I thought of for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Okay.
But,
sure, I mean, it's a great movie.
Yeah.
I talked about this with you somewhat recently, and I talked about it with a coworker, and he got very upset with me.
Oh, no.
I really like The Great Escape, but I think Chicken Run is better than The Great Escape.
You've mentioned this to me before, and I didn't give you trouble for it, which I think surprised you, if I recall.
Sure, I was expecting trouble. My coworker, was very adamant that was wrong and stupid. He hadn't watched he hadn't seen Great Escape, so I didn't take his opinion too much to heart, but I'm glad you maybe agree with me.
It's not that I agree, it's that I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other, which is something you like to say when you review movies.
That's true,
but, yeah. I guess on a similar note, I mean, the show that she is watching, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., a lot of people say the movie, and the modern movie, is better than the show was, and so, I mean, maybe we can split the difference there.
Well, I never watched the show. I can't compare it. I thought the movie was subpar.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't love the movie, but I thought it was better than I didn't have high expectations. I thought it was okay.
Have a small but vocal fan base. I will say that, at least online.
It does. Yeah. Yeah, Henry Cavill fans especially. But I guess Armie Hammer was the other person in that, right? So I guess that kind of hasn't... Now, as you can probably already tell, because nobody has interrupted us to keep us on track and, keep us in business, Mike Overhols is not on the show this week. And he had to go buy a car. Real Don Draper move. He probably had that British car salesman, talking him up and down at the Mazda place. But he could make it. But it's me and Will. It's a me and Will episode. Those can be fun. I'm not complaining.
Yeah, they can be. They can be a little tumultuous at times.
Sometimes we go on some tangents.
Yeah, that's true. But this is episode what?
This
6?
This is the fifth episode.
5, yeah.
Of the fifth episode of the fourth season. It's called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, the name of the book that the agency reads. Or I guess Don was the only one who read it as they prepare for a pitch with Honda.
Sure, yeah.
So this is the 44th episode of the entire series. It was written by Aaron Levy, and directed by Leslie Lincoln Glatter, longtime director for the show. And yeah, this episode came out August 22nd, 2010. And we haven't recorded an episode in a while. We had Mike's wedding, and we still have as we record this, we're still in the middle of stockpiling episodes before we release them all. That's what we do around here. But in terms of the episode itself, it takes place in March 1965. So Will, we're right in the middle of the 1960s. And it's one of those episodes that's very much in its time, even more so than usual. I will say that I did do the commentaries. There's only one commentary for this one, which is a tad unusual. Usually there's 2. But I didn't take copious notes this time. But we're going to shoot from the hip a little bit, and we'll see how it goes,
You know something? I did less preparation than I usually do for this as well. So I was kind of banking on you doing the homework.
Perfect. Yeah.
So, yeah, we're just going to be winging it a bit with this one, I guess. No mic, no rules.
No rules whatsoever. Because
as we all know, Mike's the one that really keeps the ship sturdy and, makes sure that everything is in line and in order.
He's
and
the adult
focused.
in the room. Yeah, he makes sure we're in bed by 9. But Will, you're going into the bathroom. I hope you're not going in there to shave your beard.
Oh yeah,
Mike's
I did shave my beard.
Me.
Yeah, I will say I shaved it before I watched this episode, so I was inspired by Sally's misbehavior, as they call it, throughout the episode.
One way to describe it. We're gonna get to that.
Sure. I mean, Part of me is relieved that, rather than inflicting crime upon innocent people as she is like hitting and slapping and committing arson and all this stuff, it's a little bit more, eternal, which is, still troubling in its own route, but at least no one else is getting hurt in the process other than, Betty and Dawn. But
she
we'll talk
humiliates her mother.
Yeah.
And almost does something
of the mobs.
Yeah. And almost traumatizes a young girl at her sleepover. So, but we'll talk about it in a minute. I do want to say for this episode. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Would that girl have known, though, if the mother didn't interrupt? I mean, not that would have been
kosher,
but
she could have woken up, right?
Sure, it's always a possibility, to be sure.
Yeah, and I remember when I first saw it, I was kind of shocked that it happened, and I'll definitely have to gauge your reaction as well, because it's definitely a moment that takes one by surprise. But yeah, this episode follows the concept of shame. That's how Matthew Weiner describes it. He says that that's basically the running theme here. Everybody's feeling shame in different ways, whether Betty is ashamed of Sally essentially and thinks that at one point even tells the therapist, Edna, played by Patricia Bethune, oh, Sally's doing this intentionally to humiliate me. And I mean, it's one of those like jaw-dropping moments, right, in the show where like you really see Betty, like her psyche just on full blast there. But it's also about Dawn, Dawn feeling a lot of shame in a lot of specific ways, being humiliated by Roger's basic, plain racism when the Japanese folks come to basically present them with the rules for the Honda pitch. The funny thing about this episode too is when I first watched it for this podcast, which I don't know how many times I've seen it at this point in general, but I was actually on a plane to Tokyo and I didn't plan it that way. I forgot that this was that episode. So it was kind of funny. I was like, oh, that's kind of a weird coincidence. I guess maybe that just means I go to Japan a lot and, well, not that impressive.
Well, I've never been to Japan. You certainly have that over me. And it sounds like you had a really nice trip to Japan. We didn't talk about it all that much, but it sounds like you had a nice time.
Yeah, it was around the same time as this episode too, because this is March 1965. I went in April, so yeah,
sweet.
Weird coincidences there. Yeah, so the whole thing with this episode is that Pete comes to the partners about a potential relationship with the Honda Motorcycle Corporation. So it's before they actually had their whole car line, obviously becoming one of the biggest car manufacturers ever, and yeah, there's a lot of drama around this pitch, and we kind of have our first Mad Men caper, Mad Men heist, as it will. Very exciting episode, and I'm a big fan of this episode in general. But did you like this one, Will Ashton, or were you too traumatized by Sally's delinquency to take it seriously?
I liked it. Yeah, I don't think it's my favorite of the ones we've seen this season. I think I liked the previous episode a little bit more that John Slattery directed, but I enjoyed it. It's fun. Especially, I love a good sort of like office caper, and the montage we get maybe 3/4 of the way through the episode where they have to fake a commercial. I thought was fantastic. I really loved the shot of Peggy just riding the motorcycle in the empty lot, just kind of showing that like she's still she's doing her job, but there's like something kind of free spirited about her, like like in the sense that we're kind of seeing more and more of the rebel kind of come out. Of
it's
Peggy.
Iconic. You can say it.
And I think that was a really great Peggy moment in particular. But yeah, I mean, it's a solid episode. I always appreciate when the episode can kind of do sort of parallels between different narratives and kind of make it pretty tidy. In this case, obviously, we have the like Dawn versus Betty, but we also have Roger and I'm blanking on her name. What's her name?
Who are you talking about again?
Redhead. Joan, yeah, sorry. I was so blank on the name for a second. Yeah, like there's kind of a like push and pull with them as well. And then in a way, I guess there's kind of like a push and pull with the US and Japan in this episode going on. And also a push and pull with Dawn and this other ad agency guy. What's his name?
Ted Shaw.
Ted, yeah.
Yeah, so we've heard of Ted before. I mean, the CGC has been brought up one or two times so far this season as the big competitor to Sterling Cooper Draper Price. And so the concept behind Ted is that he's essentially as Don says, he's trying to kind of build himself as a rival to Don, right? And there's a back and forth between them, and we see him, we see Smitty. What do you make of Ted Shaw? Do you have any kind of first impression of this guy, this stinker of a guy?
I think he has major Pete energy, and I mean Pete from season 1, maybe season 2. Because Pete's, I don't know, I mean, I never want to give Pete too much credit, but like this season, he seems a little bit more on the ball. Like, obviously, like he was the one that got this account together. He's the one that kind of has to be the adult in the room when Roger has this little slur-driven tirade in the office, which is
stands up for himself against Roger.
Sure.
Roger kind of like goes to him. He kind of recoils.
Yeah. I do gotta say, intentionally, this is one of the harder episodes to watch for like that moment. And obviously, like you said, the masturbation moment. And like, there's just a lot of like squirm inducing moments intentionally, not like, in an undeliberate sort of way. But yeah, I mean, it's not like the most comfortable viewing, but I imagine it's one that like probably rewards repeat viewings if you kind of get what it's going for and you can kind of pick apart the nuances a little bit more. But the first time watching it, you do got some squirms, I have to say.
Absolutely. I think you nailed it. And in fact, Aaron Levy won the 2011 Writers Guild of America Award for Television episodic drama category for this episode, her work on this episode. And in the commentary, so she did the commentary with Matthew Weiner, and a lot of, I think a big reason she got these accolades is because of all the research into the Japanese business culture and how that was applied here. The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, it's a real book. It's called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Patterns of Japanese Culture. It came out in 1946 by an anthropologist named Ruth Benedict. That's what we're going to be doing our next podcast on. Hope you're ready.
Did you read that book?
I haven't read that book, no. I think that though it is well regarded by some circles, at least at the time.
I will say, I mean, I wanted to look into it a little bit more. I didn't get a chance, but I did read the Mad Men Carousel chapter, and they were saying that it was, like you said, critically well regarded, but it also, I think, has been criticized for Orientalism throughout.
It's of its time, to be sure. Yeah, so you kind of have to caveat it. But one thing that the book is notable for, remember too, I mean, this is a time when it's still only been it's been about like 20 years since the end of World War II. And attitudes and perception of the Japanese is just a very different thing than it is today. A very different thing that it was in the 2000s when this show was airing, right? Or the 2010s, I think, at this point. But the concept of like a guilt and shame culture, which is what Japan had, with all the different rules, all the different mores, a lot of that stuff had to sort of be instructed to Americans because they just didn't have a concept of it. Japan, for the longest time, had been a very insular, isolated country too, right? And then of course we have like the 20th century, and they are just kind of seen as like this, this enemy to the Allies and everything. So this was one of those books in a long series of, I think, Japanese cultural history that kind of reshaped people's impression of that country. And it is kind of amazing when you look at how things have changed and how the perception of Japan has changed so drastically since then.
And I do want to say, and I really, really hope this is not too broad an overview, and I apologize if it is, but you're mentioning that shame was kind of like the big theme of the episode, and from what I can tell, shame, I think, carries a little bit more weight in Japan than maybe in the US. Not that it doesn't in the US, but like the idea of like shaming the family or like shaming somebody, I think, can be a more drastic sin than it might here, where there's kind of more rampant shamelessness, as it were. And I think that's really kind of fascinating as a center focus of this episode, which, especially given, a focus on this in the, like you said, the mid 60s. Not that 2010 wasn't a progressive time, but it also, wasn't a progressive time in many respects. And, when you go back and watch the episode from, at this point, 14 years ago, you do kind of have to wonder, like, is this going to be sensitive to the culture? Obviously, is it going to represent a way that's appropriate to time, but doesn't, make you squirm for the unintentional reasons? And I think they strike that balance pretty well in this episode. And I was curious if you agree or disagree.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think the show, I guess, bottom line, I think it ages well, especially when you look at it fairly as like when the show came out and what it's trying to say. And I really respect, I think, that especially Erin Levy, when she was writing this episode, really brought forth this concept of the shame culture in Japan really coming from this idea of, the collective, right? And the community. That's where that shame comes from. And there's this sort of contradiction in America where Americans, like the prototypical Don Draper, like John in this episode, try to come off as like individualistic, right? Like I'm for myself, and why does everyone want to talk about everything? Like I want my work to speak for itself and all this stuff. But at the same time, there is a collectivist mindset, right? There's a contradiction there. There's like almost a dishonesty or almost a dissonance between understanding that like Betty, when this stuff happens with Sally, it's apparent that her mind instantly goes to being embarrassed, not really being concerned for what's going on with her daughter, but how it's affecting her because of how the collective sees her. And so I think Levy found this really great way to illustrate the way that like, the people in this episode, the Americans in this episode, think that they're so different from Japanese people, but not really. We have our own weird customs. You know what I mean? And we have all of our own little weird mores that the Japanese people probably look at as kind of weird and arbitrary.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we've talked about it plenty of times before, but I think with Betty, so much relies on keeping up appearances. And I think there is already a sort of shame that comes at this time with being a divorced woman and, remarrying so shortly after she got divorced from her husband of several years and had several kids with. And so I know like from her sort of troubled relationship with her mom, she carries a lot of baggage about, being raised and the humiliation and the torment that she talks about with her mom. And I think it's very telling that this episode throughout kind of has like the way it's directed and the way it's shot. There's a lot of like wide lens shots. Like there's a lot of like kind of like focusing on the room and the architecture of the room. And that's something that's really brought out with Matt Zoller-Zeiss's chapter. But one thing that really struck me, and something I'm surprised he didn't point out in that chapter, is in the therapist's office, you see like a little dollhouse they focus on.
Yeah.
And
they bring it up in the commentary.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, but Weiner loves that shot. He thinks it's just so like just dreamy and beautifully done.
And that's, correct me, that is Betty that sees her, or was that Sally that saw that?
Betty.
It was Betty. Okay, that's what I thought. Because, yeah, I mean, it kind of encapsulates, especially with her, undeliberately sort of confessing, sort of openly a lot of her things, like this idea of like, she has this very clear view of what she wants to be, like this kind of all-American mom and woman and stuff. And the idea of like, she's trying so hard to keep up appearances and not try to like, disrupt this image that's already been kind of fractured in many different ways. And then knowing that what's going on with her daughter, I think even at one point when she's talking to Dawn over the phone, she's not even ashamed really that Sally's getting into masturbation, like particularly at a pretty young age, but rather it's just the idea of like doing it in a public setting and bringing shame and embarrassment to her and her daughter and all this stuff. And
well, there's two instances where she's talking for herself and she's talking for her mother. When she says, you don't do those things in private and you especially don't do them in front of other people, that's her mother talking, because that's probably exactly what her mother said to her.
Yeah,
but when she's talking to the therapist, she says, like, I understand, like, people, like, that's normal that people are going to do this, just not in front of other people. So there's an understanding there that that's actually what Betty thinks.
Well, I was wondering about that because, like, a part of me wondered if that was because she's trying to keep up appearances. Like she's in public in a way that when she's with Sally in private, like that's like her. I was wondering if that was maybe her actual thoughts, even though I was thinking about that. Like that very much seems to mirror something that her mom said to her and that she's kind of reiterating. But I was wondering if what she was saying in the therapist's office, something like that, is that totally the truth, or is that something that she's saying to sort of censor her real thoughts in a way that she knows, even though it's like private. And I think she even, there's like a moment where she feels relief, where she's like, okay, nothing I say in here is going to be, taken out context or said elsewhere. Right. Like, I didn't know if there was a part of her that was not censoring herself, but maybe like more self-conscious of what she's saying to another person that's outside of the family.
I think it's more about what Dr. Faye Miller says in this episode. So when she's in the kitchen with Dawn and they're drinking the sake together, Faye basically says it outright. She's like, you'd be surprised what people will say to an interested stranger. And I just think that it's the smallest act of Edna, this therapist, putting Betty at ease almost immediately and seeming interested in what she has to say. That's what gets Betty to open up. And I think you even see a little bit of it with Henry. Henry kind of like shows that he's interested in Betty, and he's not a stranger, but like he shows that he's like when after she has a whole thing with Sally, when Dawn drops her off after cutting her hair, like Betty's fuming, but Henry calms her down. He because he's kind of empathizing with her and he softens her, and like they kind of reconcile the situation there.
But even still, like generally from what we've seen of Henry, outside of him being a bit of a homewrecker of sorts, he's kind of been certainly the more level-headed, the more adult, the more supportive he's like a partner.
Yeah, he did a very bad thing, breaking up this family.
Yes, yeah.
But he just seems like a very decent guy.
Sure, but
like, hard to hate him. Like people hate him because they root for Dawn, so like there's that. But if you look at him objectively, like he's kind of a good husband. He treats those kids well. Like he seems to have a good head on his shoulder. He is a Republican, but I mean, it is the 60s, so who knows what that means back then.
Sure. I mean, I was going to say, for whatever virtues we can expound upon the man, he does have this very stigmatized view of therapy, which is fascinating and not unexpected, certainly. But like when Betty brought up that she did, go to therapy for a little bit, as we saw in the earlier seasons, he was like, rather than like, oh, that must have been difficult or like whatever. He's like, well, what was wrong with you or something along those lines. And yeah, I mean, there is a sort of sense of like he views therapy as like something that's a little taboo, and even though he's supportive of Sally going to therapy, or something about the idea of his wife going to therapy is a little unclothed in some respects.
Well,
which is fascinating.
I think he's a little blindsided. I think the implication is that he went to therapy, and then so when she brings it up, I think he didn't know that, and I think you could read it as concern in that instance of like, oh, were you going through something and something I didn't know about and you didn't tell me? Or because he probably had to go through therapy. This is how I read it, because of his divorce, right? And so he probably did the same thing alongside his daughter, but just like separate. And he might just be thinking that like, oh, is Betty doing this without talking to me about it? And then he seems to kind of figure out like, oh no, that's not the case. But then he is curious, right? And I think he's still okay about it. Like when she's just like, can we leave it at that? And he's like, yeah, sure. Like he doesn't push it.
Sure. I mean, I think, at least at this point, broadly speaking, there are more points in his favor than against him, especially if you level him to Dawn in the husband race. But yeah, I was going to say, as far as that conversation with the sake that you're mentioning, I do love that that's in the kitchen. They make it look like, not like really like your typical work kitchen where it's just like a fridge and then like a microwave and then like some shelves. Like it actually looks like someone's kitchen in their house. And, it does feel like more homey, and it does feel like a really interesting divide between the personal and the professional, something that the show explores in a lot of different respects, obviously. And yeah, I think that's a really great and compelling scene.
Yeah.
And I also just enjoy
Faye's literally barefoot in that scene. Yeah.
And I love watching characters drink sake because it reminds me of when I sometimes have sake and I'm like,
it's
good.
Sake.
Sorry, sake. I'm assuming you had plenty of sake in Japan.
Oh, yes. We have plenty of sake in the house, and we had some in a nice restaurant for anniversary.
Sure, that sounds. The only thing about sake is you got to be careful. It's a little dangerous. Like it's very, very smooth. It goes down easy, but it's in short quantities and it's expensive. So
I thought you were going to say dangerous, like it gets you like drunk, but you're just saying like, nah, you're just going to spend too much money.
Well, I mean, I think if you're drinking sake, the implication is you're going to get drunk, which
Not to go too far off this tangent, but we did go to a sake bar that it was like unlimited sake for an hour. And that led to a night that no one, including the Ministry of Japan, will ever forget.
Boy, I thought you were going to say a night no one remembers.
Well, a few people will remember, including, a certain drag performer at a drag bar nearby and a few other surprise cameos. We had some fun that night in Tokyo.
Okay, I am very curious. I imagine that's a conversation for off the air.
Yeah, that's a conversation for my therapist. But yeah, great scene with Dawn and Faye in the kitchen, and especially because it is more of a calm conversation. So the last time they really talked, it was a bit of a it was a bit more consternation, right? It was after the focus group, and Dawn was arguing with Faye about, the research and everything with, the idea of doing the ritual with like Clearasil and stuff. Clearasil, which by the way gets mentioned here because that account goes to Ted Shaw along with Hyali. So there's that tension as well. And yeah, when the conversation I think they had before that is the Christmas one, I want to say, where they're kind of like talking, and she drops that line on Dawn where she's just like, "You'll be married in a year." Just kind of, a little condescending, a little bit of like of a know-it-all, a little smug. And I think that kind of had an effect on Dawn. So they seem to have this kind of repertoire, like they seem to, I don't like the concept of having like a work wife or like a work husband, but they do seem to have like some kind of like energy there where they kind of spar a little bit. And I think he kind of respects her a little bit for just being somebody who stands up for herself. It reminds me a lot of Rachel Menken, but I don't know if you agree. I mean, you're watching this for the first time. I'm curious what you think of how that back and forth is developing.
I mean, I'm fascinated because, as we've seen, Dawn has a thing for brunettes, not blondes, typically. So, you see this blonde lady and you're thinking like, oh, I don't know. I mean, she is blonde, so you don't know.
Dick Whitman goes for the brunettes, but Don Draper goes for the blondes. Don Draper goes for Bethany, played by Anna Camp, who's in this episode.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point, yeah. Yeah, it's new Dawn, new tricks, I suppose. I don't mean that in a dismissive way, of course. I was going to say also, not only do they lose those 2 accounts to this new company, but they also lose, what's his name, Smitty?
They lose Smitty?
Or what's his face? The guy,
you mean
the turncoat.
Because he goes to CGC. Well, no, because they didn't lose him. He probably went to McCann and then ended up at CGC. Remember?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Well,
he was like a freelancer. Well, he was a freelancer too. How is he a turncoat? He needs a job.
He changed sides. He
didn't
went over.
Change anything? How do you know that they brought him back on at all? He probably just needed to work.
This business is about loyalty. And
they probably couldn't afford him because he's a freelancer. So they have Joey as a freelance art director, and they probably couldn't afford somebody else. There aren't a lot of writers at the firm right now, and Smitty was more senior. So they don't have Paul, right? So you kind of see like Peggy does like lion's share of the writing at the firm these days. So I think the implication is rather that Kurt and Smitty kind of floated around a bit, and then Smitty ended up at CGC because it's more like Sterling Cooper. And that's more his vibe, man. But I do think in the commentary, Weiner did say that there was a version of the scene they shot where he literally fires Smitty right on the spot for what he says. So I think my headcanon is that Smitty does get fired after this, because I will reveal to you now, Will Ashton, we never see him again in the show. This is his last appearance.
Last time? Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we never see Kurt again. So his last appearance already came and gone.
Okay. Wait, who was Kurt again?
Kurt was his homosexual partner.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
The designer.
Oh, so whenever we saw him last, that was the last time we saw him.
Yeah, we haven't seen him since season 3. So yeah, he's already And I do think that Ted might have meant like, oh, why don't you go work for your boyfriend? Maybe that's what he meant. That like Kurt went off and did his own thing, maybe. So I like to think he did go off to work for Kurt, and then they fell in love.
That's great. I was gonna say, they do kind of heighten up who the employee of theirs that used to work for Dawn is, and I think you can see where I'm going with this. They're like
Chauncey.
Yes. They're like, this guy used to work for Don Draper, and let me tell you, he's got a bone to pick with the man. You see Chauncey come in.
What was Don Draper like?
But this is like a new age Chauncey. Like he has like a high turtleneck and like low glasses that hang on his nose, and like
hasn't cut his hair in months.
Right. Yeah. Like long, like bangs, but like long, like on the sides, and like he's like bark. And he's like, a genius, you say? Do you say that about me?
Yes. And for the listeners who were expecting Will Ashton to say that Sal was the person that he thought, that didn't even occur to me, but that would have been pretty funny actually if we had kept that a surprise for you, including Brian.
Oh yeah,
Brian Pat himself. It's like, we'll keep the secret from Will, don't worry. But yeah, so We do get to see Smitty again, and there's that whole. Okay, I had to ask you, when Ted is doing the whole pitch thing where he's like, okay, they're driving the motorcycle, but he's a she, beach blonde or whatever he says, and like takes her helmet off. And so Weiner claims that he's just like, I just wanted to make sure that ad was like good, and people would be like, that's a good ad, even though that like Ted's a villain. And I'm like, that ad sounds terrible. And I don't know if that's just me, though. I don't know if that's me just being like, it's not good because Ted, I don't like Ted. I like Don. Like, I don't know if it's that. But that ad just, I don't know. It sounds kind of lame.
I thought it sounded kind of cool as a build-up, but then it kind of just got goofy as it went along. And that's why
exactly
the guy was just kind of like, what are you talking about? Like, this is, like, we don't have the budget for this. Because, like, initially he's kind of, like, into it, right? Like, he's kind of like, oh, yeah, okay, like, how are we going to get that shot? Like, the director will figure it out. And then, like, once he kind of goes into, like, the spiel, it's like, no, that's stupid. Like, don't do that. We don't have the money for that either, but don't do that.
And hey, Don's plan worked, and they do spend a bunch of money on this ad, and then probably smokes them a bit, and it ends up being all for nothing. Moral of the story. Now, that's the aspect of the episode I personally don't like as much. When Don kind of goes in, it feels a little bit too after school special to me, where like, and then Pete and Lane walk into the office and they're like, but even though we didn't get the account, they liked us. We were the most charming. And I was just like,
yeah, it felt a little like episode of the week sort of thing for me.
Exactly.
In a way that I don't really expect from Mad Men. Like, it feels a little like, it felt very TV, I guess, which obviously it's a TV show, but you kind of expect something a little bit more literary or a little bit more...
Right. It was too tidy.
Yeah.
There is... Also, I was going to mention this earlier, but in terms of... Because we were talking about blondes and brunettes for Dawn, I was thinking, why not a redhead for Dawn? And I have the number one candidate. That's right. Dr. Edna Keener.
Oh, boy, yeah, that would be great.
They'd have some beautiful babies.
They would have some stimulating conversations together. I know that.
That's right. Well, he doesn't believe in therapy, but that's her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
The tension between Pete and Roger, this I think is where it's really starting to percolate. We've gotten some hints already. You've touched on it, not just in this episode, but before, that Pete is kind of on an ascent right now. He's on a roll. He's on a bit of a streak. He's bringing in new clients, and he's just, it seems like he's fundamentally gotten better at his job. And Roger kind of has this dual sort of like, he can't get over World War II. He can't get over, the fact that like they can't just live off the fumes of Lucky Strike, which makes up so much of their business, that Lucky Strike ditching them would basically be the end. And Pete, as he says here, is trying to build something. He wants to kind of get away from that attachment. He's the more progressive of the two for the era, right? He's more kind of like, the world has moved on, and not just from like Japan, but I think Roger here is at, and it's like has moved on from him. Because when he mentions too that like, that they're not the same people, like Roger's like, I'm the same people. And I just want to point out, I mean, this is such a great season for Slattery. I love him in this episode because he plays a terrible person in this so well. Because this is a guy who's normally the life of the party in this show. He's normally the one cracking the fun jokes. And then we get to see like, oh, the jokes he's cracking here are really messed up. They're really awful. And that he's just being super bigoted. And I was curious what you make of that. I think the performance makes it playfully ambiguous, where you can read it in multiple ways, but like you can sort of read it as like he's nervous about his place in the world and how he fits in with the agency at this point, but also that he has a genuine hurt there in terms of the past and what he went through during World War II and the toxicity that has like blossomed, maybe blossomed isn't the right word, in his heart and soul since then through bigotry.
Yeah, I mean, I do think from a writing standpoint, and this isn't really the blame of this episode, I think it just maybe a short sight of the show in general. Like it does feel a little abrupt, his like intense like war disdain. I don't know if you agree. I mean, not that like they would have a ton of opportunities to. I think it's believably abrupt. Sure.
I think stuff like that can trigger. I think that's the point.
Like,
we've seen little doses of it here and there with Roger. Like he literally was in blackface last season, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly not winning points in the race relations category throughout the series, but I don't know. I just feel like his relationship to the war is something that I feel like the show hasn't, like, they've mentioned it, I think, a little bit, maybe, perhaps.
I think more than you're remembering. It gets brought up, but like, we've watched a lot of episodes at this point, and
sure,
he's had those conversations with Dawn, and he's kind of it's more stemming from the like, oh, you're talking about your war. He has that whole spiel in the first season about like when he was, in the, I think it was not a pilot, but he was like talking to Betty basically about some of his war stories. So like, it's been sprinkled, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll concede to that. Yeah. I think, it felt a little abrupt, but I agree that like there's an intentionality to it that, makes it work, to be sure. And yeah, I mean, I think the arc that we're seeing for Roger, I mean, like I mentioned before, it's not easy to watch, but it is believable as far as like what we know of Roger. And, like we're watching him, like, the whole series at this point, we've been watching him kind of on descend in general. Like he's probably at his peak, like in the pilot or in like the early seasons, like just before his ulcer and like his.
I'd say before the episode Red in the Face when Dawn shows him up. That's peak Roger in the show.
And yeah, throughout the show, we just kind of see this man who, in many respects, never really grew up, kind of come to terms with like the twilight years of his life and kind of coming to grasp with like, he's the old dog in the game. He doesn't really have the skills that he once had before. He's not as acquainted to what the 60s demand of the job. And yeah, I mean, it's tough for someone like that who has been so blasé about a lot of things, who isn't really culturally sensitive or empathetic to a lot of people, kind of get his comeuppance, because he is charming and he is like a fun, charismatic character and quippy and someone who's always, sharp with the joke and all that. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel unbelievable to me, even though, I agree that like it is a little abrupt, but I can see why they're forcing Roger to really kind of come to terms with his, uglier side. And I think the show is just kind of following that progression, or rather decline of his personality and his well-being and whatnot. Yeah. It's been a rough few years for old Mr. Sterling, and I don't imagine things are going to get much better from here.
You might disagree, but I firmly believe that if the whole Honda thing had happened in seasons 1 or 2, maybe even season 3, I don't think he would have acted this way. I don't think he would have blown up the account. I do think that there is sort of a blending of insecurities for him here where he's at like a trigger point. And so what I mean is that it's not just that he's racist toward, Japan. I think a lot of it is also like he cannot stomach the idea that when he's in this agency that is much more vulnerable than Sterling Cooper was, right? That he would essentially be replaced, or sort of like his standing with like Lucky Strike could be superseded by this Japanese client brought on by this young kid who he tried to fire in season 1. You know what I mean? So I think that there's just like this kind of, I think that's where like the anger and the sort of like the childishness is really coming from. And I think it's bolstered by how we see Betty act in a very similar way with Sally.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we didn't really talk about it all that much, but I think even more so than his general bigotry and war trauma, it's the fact that they were going behind his back with this whole thing and trying to supersede his power. And like you said, he is in a more vulnerable place because it's not just, Sterling Cooper. It's now Sterling Cooper, Lane, Draper, Oliver and company, and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice and Monsters and Men and whatever the whole thing is at this point. You're just going to let me hang on the vine there, I guess, for a little bit, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Yes, as you should. But no, I mean, I think it's a pride thing in many respects. Like, I think it's him, his ego was hurt, his sense of pride about being kind of like a well-positioned, like, veteran of the field is in jeopardy. And even someone he like felt like he was equals to, like with Cooper, is just like Koopa is kind of being short-sighted as well. And yeah, I think it's a lot of different factors, obviously, but I agree that I think we're seeing a distinctly different Roger here than we would have seen in the past seasons and previous years of the show.
I gotta say, Burt Cooper, super fun in this episode. Just his,
Oh yeah, he's great. Yeah.
his knowledge and awareness of like the Japanese culture. It kind of reminds. I feel a little bit like Burt Cooper sometimes, where I try to explain Japan stuff to you, and I'm just like, no, Will Ashton, that means that the podcast is canceled. And they're like, what? But they said that they wouldn't cancel it. I'm like,
Sure.
but Will Ashton, did we get a gift? It's like, no, we didn't. I don't know. But I should say that I kind of made it sound like there wasn't anything that sort of came out of the whole Honda thing. They did say that Sterling Cooper Draper Price would have first shot at marketing Honda's automobiles, like when they get to that. So I guess that's something, but it's a little bit of like, okay, but really, I think that Sterling SCDP, they don't have a car and they don't have experience with a car. So to me, it just seems like faint sort of like, your gratification, I guess, if you will. Not a lot of Lane in this episode. We get some of Phoebe, the nurse who did not pay attention. I feel so bad for her because, like, what was she supposed to do?
Yeah, me too.
Sally was in the bathroom.
Right.
Like, what was she supposed to, like, hear the scissors, clicking and clacking or something in the bathroom? Or
Don needed to blame somebody, and I don't think he felt comfortable blaming his daughter, so he had to blame the other adult in the room. And, I do feel for her. It wasn't Phoebe's fault, but she was the person on watch. But at the same time, Don probably should have been spending his days with the kids.
Glad you brought that up. So in the commentary, Weiner talks about how that's such a common thing that he was hearing when he was talking to people from this era, like kids of divorced dads in the 60s. And he said that, it's a very common thing is this idea that the dads would just keep dating and they wouldn't know what to do with themselves with the kids. And so they would go on dates and hire babysitters. And it just always seemed very weird to him. But he slowly kind of started to get a better understanding of, he said there was a real story where someone said like that horrible feeling of relief when you like drop off those kids and then you miss them, but like you don't, but then you do. It's like so real. And then that's something that I really like about the show because it investigates a very uncomfortable feeling because nobody wants to say that out loud, that
Sure.
they feel relieved when their kid isn't around. But like, we're selfish human beings. Like we have, selfish, needs and things like that. And I think Don especially is just like clearly uncomfortable with those kids. And he kind of always has been.
Sure. Don, the kids are a drag. Like, he's a bachelor now. He needs a...
Yeah. Will's just like, that Bobby, like, shoot, I'd be bored too.
I was happy we saw Eugene again. Like, I always worry about that poor Eugene. It was good to see he's presumably doing well. I mean,
he's playing with his toys.
Yeah, he's on like a little like scooter thing or something, I think.
Cock blocking them.
But
they couldn't wait to go at it later. Yeah.
I'd be remiss, I feel, if we didn't bring up the Benihana scene, just because I think it's so funny. Like I know this is like the very first Benihana, and like they're like, it's like a treat to go to like this very first Benihana in Brooklyn, but it's such an American idea to like be like, I need to understand Japanese culture. Let's go to Benihana.
Yeah, especially as we look at it from our current lens. It wasn't a real Benihana that they shot that in, by the way. They just made because of the trademarks and stuff, according to the commentaries. But they did a really good job and like getting the set, like it's a real restaurant that they just like made to look like Benihana, and they pulled it off pretty well.
You can tell it's pretty early on because they don't do as much of the tricks, like where, like they flip the thing and they pull out their pocket and put the meat in and like, like where they throw it into people's mouths. And I don't know. Have you been to Benihana before?
I have, sure. Yeah. A few
I think
times.
it's fun. Yeah. It's not like something you do all the time, but like the last time I went to Benihana's was, when was that? Oh, I think my sister-in-law's baby shower is in Benihana, like on the lower level.
There you go.
Yeah, I was invited because they didn't have enough people. So like they had like a guy's table. I don't know if I ever told you about this, where there's like a guy's table for the baby shower. So it was like my brother and like several of his friends and then me.
That's awesome. Shout out to Nate Ashton. But I will say, I went to Benihana right before I went to Japan because I wanted to know more about Japanese culture before I went to Japan. Yeah. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, so and then it looks like Bethany, the Anna Camp's character, has so far been with 5 dates. I think she says 5 dates in 3 months or something like that. I forget the exact number.
3 dates in 5 months, if I recall.
And that might be more accurate.
Which
it is March, and their first date was around Thanksgiving. So yeah, 5 months.
Bless her patience. 3 dates in 5 months. That's tricky. That's commitment.
Yeah. So what do you think the holdup is? Do you think he's waiting to see if the blonde hair is fake and she's just been dyeing it?
Yeah, I knew it. It was a wig. I don't know. I mean, they got along decently well the last time we saw it, but it doesn't seem like they have like that, like undeniable spark. Like even the few moments we saw with what's her name from The Office, the barefoot lady,
Faye Miller.
Faye, yeah. Like there was almost an undeniable chemistry there that I feel like it's been very cordial. I think with like Dawn and Anna Camp's character, like it's like
been kind of wholesome. So
yeah,
far.
It's like I don't know. I do worry, especially with like all the stuff going on with Sally. Like there's like this sort of thing where like he feels it needs to be kind of chaste because there's something about her that probably reminds him of Sally, and it's like obviously he's not gonna really be like lusting over someone that reminds him of his daughter. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I don't know. I feel like there is something to be said there about. Like,
I think it's still like he's punishing himself. I think that he doesn't want a real relationship. He just kind of wants to drink and only sleep with like a prostitute because he's just kind of like he doesn't want to feel like I don't know like he did. I think that he's just resistant to that progressing really, but he's still kind of keeping her on the hook because he's not totally sure. That's my guess.
It does kind of feel like they're going through the motions as far as their relationship goes. Like it doesn't feel like it's hot and bothered, it's just kind of like, they're
I've
just
been
like
thinking about you so much the last 6 weeks.
Yeah. And we know Don is someone with a high libido, so it's not like he's, typically one to wait. But yeah,
he probably would be chasing after her if he wasn't getting what he's getting from a sex worker, right?
Yeah. But I mean, especially this season, we've been seeing Don's just been kind of lost. Like he doesn't really have a sense of purpose at home. He doesn't really have a sense of commitment at his job. Like his old secretary lady was talking about like
Ida Blankenship, the best secretary in SCDP history. Well, you're always leaping in there.
Well, I mean, it's like she's kind of acknowledging that like he's not really trying to hide as much anymore. Like he's just kind of just like whatever. But it does seem like his gears do get into motion with this Honda account, at least when he has to like kind of save it.
Yeah, he wakes up a little bit.
Yeah, it's like we keep seeing this with like little moments. Like his spark kind of comes alive briefly in different things. Like even when he's like on the phone with the columnist guy, and like initially he's just kind of like whatever, like I don't care. And then that guy's like he says in the rearview mirror, and then you kind of see like old Don spark in his eye, and he's just like I've never heard of him, like that old classic kind of pithy line of his. And it's like little moments like that where you see Don, but then like he's still kind of in a fog still. He's just like not fully there. And I think that's why, was it SCDP or SDCP?
Yeah, no, you got it right the first time. SCDP.
He's stumbling. So it's like I think Don's not fully 100% there. But I don't know. I mean, Pete's pulling the weight at least. So, I think they're chugging along. But I think Don needs to be, in full gear before the company gets to Sterling Cooper territory.
Yeah. And I think that that's just so well illustrated by Blankenship, just kind of making his job even harder. And he just kind of has to step up because he has to step up. So very, very true. We covered a lot of the episode. I think we didn't totally go there with like the Betty stuff necessarily. Just in terms did we?
I mean, I do think it's funny that, I don't know if funny is the right word, but her scene where she like kind of, releases a lot of the feelings that she's had to the therapist sort of unprompted in some respects reminds me of the Always Sunny episode where they go to therapy and there's a bit, you might even see this. I know you don't watch a ton of Always Sunny, but Frank is like very, very resistant to going to therapy. And like the therapist doesn't even say anything. He just kind of like unzips on his own. Like he just like, I haven't been interested in therapy since I was younger. He's like, oh, really? It's like, and then he just kind of like opens up on his own will. And then he's like, starts crying. He's like, you unzipped me. Like, what have you done? Like, it's just all him, but like, he blames the therapist for like putting him in a vulnerable state. And I kind of feel like that's Betty's relationship to therapy in some respects. Like, it's like the psychoanalyzing is always sort of there with her. But I think she just doesn't want to like sit down in the room and deal with it. And, like, I think she's like, maybe subconsciously hyper aware of her faults and insecurities, but it's like she can articulate them in some respects, but she just doesn't want to sit in the room, like I said, and like sit with those feelings in some respects. And I think that's probably the stigma of the time in some respects, but I think it's also just like Betty doesn't want to be the adult usually. I think she wants like someone like Henry to kind of take those responsibilities. She doesn't want to adopt the role that her mom had, kind of repeat the mistakes that she did. And yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. Yeah.
I did want to do a little bit of quick trivia. There's one thing where Pete Campbell, he gets a lot of fun dialogue here. He says that the meeting with the Honda executives was a Margaret Dumont-sized disaster. Had you ever heard of Margaret Dumont before?
Yeah, a little bit.
She was an actress who actually died in 1965.
Right.
Who was she's one of the buffoonish foils, as it were, in some of the Marx Brothers movies.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, just kind of like a clueless character. And I guess it's like basically Pete is like likening this to a Groucho type parody sort of thing. So I think that's just a fun. He also gets to say Christ on a cracker. Where do you get off? Good old Pete. He's fun and nice when he wants to be. This is pretty interesting. So this was brought up in the commentaries, but the director of the episode, Leslie Linka Glader, who we've talked about on the show plenty of times, apparently lived in Japan for several years and is fluent in Japanese. So when they had they had Japanese American actors hired for this episode, as we met them, they're all Japanese American. And yeah, Glader was able to speak to them in fluent Japanese, and apparently they were very taken aback and surprised by that.
That's amazing. It's cool.
Yeah. There was another thing here. We already mentioned The Man from U.N.C.L.E. It was the show that was being shown.
We did. We kind of skirted around the masturbation scene, I guess. And I don't know how much you really want to get into it per se, but like I will say,
there's an obvious thing there, isn't there? Of like Sally's kind of going through puberty. She's about to, at least, and she's in a situation where like the characters kind of say it out loud, like her parents are sleeping with other people, and she wants to kind of be an adult. She wants to understand. I think there's this like tension for her to understand like why her parents would split up. And when apparently someone explained to her what doing it is, which is based on like a real thing. That's another piece of trivia. Apparently, I think, who was it? I think it might have been Glader. But somebody in the show had a story where their daughter told them that a girl at school told them that it's when the boy pees in the girl. Yeah.
Well, I mean, they got 50% right, I guess. But no, I mean, what I was more going to comment on the filmmaking approach of it, which, I mean, when it started, I knew where it was going. I was like, ooh, like, where are we going to go with this? I think it's done tastefully. Like, it's more about the emotion of it. Like, it's a tricky thing, especially with an actual child actress. Like,
and they did get permission from her mother, and yeah,
did they? I mean, I have no idea. Yeah,
they did. They did.
So. Yeah, I mean, I think they handle it well. It's like focused more on her face and the physical aspects of it, and like, it's I don't know. It's a tough scene to kind of crack, and I don't know. Like I said, I don't really want to dive too much into it. I think, from my perspective, it was done as tastefully as something like that can be done, I guess. But yeah, it's tough. I don't know.
Apparently, the only censor issue that they ran into, according to Weiner, is that there's the scene where the mother, brings Sally back home from the sleepover. And originally, she was going to tell Betty what happened with Sally in front of Sally. But the censors actually said, like, no, you can't do that. Like, you can't talk about masturbation and things like that in front of children on TV. So that was the thing that they censored. And so they had to write in the whole thing where Sally runs upstairs. But then Aaron Levy and Matthew Weiner agreed. It's like, that actually worked out better because that was more realistic, situation that Sally wouldn't want to be there listening to this. She would run away.
Well, not only that, but like the character, the mom, I mean, from the little bit that we know her, we can see it. She's very, like old fashioned, regressive, and like she wouldn't even want to talk about it in front of the kid, even though like obviously the kid would know in some respects what happened. But you know, it like, you know, it didn't seem off to me like there was censorship there for that. So
yeah, agreed. Yeah, you wouldn't have noticed, you know, unless they mentioned it. So yeah, that's the episode. And there was something I wanted to bring up. So Emily St. James, who, you know, was writing about Mad Men back for the AV Club intermittently in the 20-teens, had a little snippet from her review here, and I kind of want to put it out there and see what you think. So I'm gonna read this, and it's something I think touched on a little bit, but she said, outside of the season premiere, talking about season 4, of course, it often seems like every episode of Mad Men this year has been greeted by deeply divided critical reactions. Dawn's sojourn to California was poignant and moving. No, it was the first bad episode of the series. Last week's Peggy and Pete dual storyline was lively and funny and one of the best the show has ever done. No, it was boring and stupid. With a caveat that I honestly think everyone who writes about Mad Men would rather be watching Mad Men than just about anything else on the air this summer. No matter how we feel the episodes match up to our memories of the prior seasons, it seems like this season is shaping up to be the first season where Mad Men deeply splits fans and critics right down the middle. And yet, none of us are objecting to the same things. Some of us wonder just what the show's building to with the whole Don Draper is a lost plotline and worry that it's not going to say anything meaningful about the character when it's all said and done. Some of us find Sally Draper plotlines interminable, and some of us think Betty Francis is slowly turning into Livia Soprano. So that's a nice little snippet in time of like this review, which came out the day after this episode aired, August 23rd, 2010. And I have to, of course, say for me, you know, I was watching the show at this point, but I didn't really have a sense for like what the critics were saying. You know, I wasn't reading, you know, AV Club back then. I wasn't reading, I think St. James links a few articles to like show what she means by like critics disagreeing. So it's like, oh, this critic thought that this was good. This critic didn't, blah, blah, blah. But what's your take on that, Will, in terms of like, you know, does that kind of give you or spark anything for you in terms of how you're processing this season so far? Like, do you find any like kind of common ground with some of the critics there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad she brought up Sopranos already, because I think it's kind of hard not to compare the two shows. And I think the 4 seasons of Sopranos does feel sort of akin to this, because that's like the 9/11 season, if I recall correctly. And that's like a lot of the characters are morally adrift. And I think from what I can recall, that's one of the weaker seasons of Sopranos, especially coming off the 3rd season, which I think is one of the best seasons. I just feel like the show kind of was trying different things. It was trying to be a little bit more existential, but it didn't really find a sure footing in that regard until like the 5th season. So it not that season was bad altogether, but it does have like the Christopher Columbus episode, which is like pretty easily like the worst episode. And like, it's a lot of like down points for the show in general. But I will say that with this season, at least, I mean, I'm still going through it. We're not even halfway yet. I think this is my favorite so far. Like, I think this is really the show shaping up into what I always presume Mad Men to be. And that's not to say that the last 3 seasons were weak or anything. I think every season I've seen so far, broadly speaking, has been good. But I think this is like the most confident the show has been. I think this is the most accomplished the show has been, but also the most adventurous and the most, you know, soul searching and experimental in some respects. And I don't know. I think this is a really, so far at least, well put together season. I've been excited to see where it goes, not only in terms of like character development, but just like where they're going to push themselves stylistically and see if they're going to be a little bit more emboldened in some of the ways that we see, like with episodes past, like where it's a little bit more surrealist with when Betty gave birth to Eugene, or is it going to be a little bit more kind of mirroring the films of the time and kind of showing this like pushback to the olden ways and kind of being a little bit more bold and creatively challenging. And yeah, I mean, I am enjoying the season. I can see why it can be divisive, because it's not like the Dawn that we're used to seeing, and it's not like what I think people were sold for those first 3 seasons. But I don't know. I find myself intrigued and certainly excited to see where it goes. I don't know generally where your thoughts are on this 4th season, but I'm with it so far.
Yeah, I'm with it. I like this season a lot. I think when I first watched it, I was a bit uncomfortable because it does take you aback to see Dawn kind of on the back foot. But I like that a lot because it's a natural ebb and flow of a person's life and it makes the show more intriguing and interesting. I honestly have always been a little bit baffled by some of the criticism for this season at the time it was airing. And I think that time has been good to Mad Men overall, where most people just seem to look at season 2 as kind of the low point. Whereas I think in this case, like people were kind of looking back on season 2 almost nostalgically. I don't know if that's really the case. And normally that'd be a great place to end it. But there is one piece of trivia I forgot. The drinking bird, Will Ashton. I forgot to mention the drinking bird from Japan. That is a period accurate one that they got. And
nice.
Apparently it was really hard to find one that was period accurate and it still worked.
Yeah.
And we got a great line out of it. It's like, how do I get you to work?
Yeah.
Just great Don line right there.
Yeah. That's good dad joke too that you can see. So yeah, that was a fun touch for sure.
Oh, and there was one more thing I wanted to mention from Emily St. James, and then we'll end it, I promise. Emily St. James has this nice little, I guess, like sum up of Dawn's dating. So she says, in a way, all of Dawn's interactions with women this season has started to feel like Ted's early dates on How I Met Your Mother. Faye's suggestion that Dawn would end up with another wife soon enough in the Christmas episode was clearly the show letting us know where it's going. And at this point, we're just waiting to see if it's Bethany, Phoebe, Allison, some other secretary, or odds-on favorite, Faye herself, who increasingly is dressed and shot to look just like Betty. What do you think, Will Ashton? Is this how I mad your mother?
Well, I mean, I don't know how much I should say, but I have been spoiled on who he gets with. So, like, I know like, who the eventual wife is. But, like, I'm watching this season intrigued to see, like, how they're kind of establishing that and, like, where the breadcrumbs lie.
How did you get spoiled, Will Ashton? How did it happen?
I mean, that was just, like...
Was it Twitter?
Osmosis. No, I think I've seen...
Osmosis.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen,
you see
screenshots
tweets
from the show? No, I mean,
on Twitter. And when I told you
not just on Twitter. I mean, you got to remember that this is like, so like 2010, 2011 was probably when I became aware of the show and was like sort of following from a distance, like its ascension and like seeing it in magazines and seeing it talked about online. I wasn't really following the coverage like you said, but I was just like aware of it. Like it's just like things like that where it's like I know that, like certain characters are going to be pivotal later on, if they're memed or if they become relevant in certain respects. But obviously I'm not going to spoil it to listeners. I would hope, if they don't know, they stay unspoiled. But yeah, there's just some things that I think for a show like this, growing up when it's most popular, I'm just going to be aware of. I think it's unavoidable. You can disagree with that all you want, but it is what it is.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Mad Men. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back to talk about the next episode, which is Waldorf Stories. Very curious title.
Like from the Muppets? Are you upset